So the USMCA review date was July 1st, 2026. The World Cup was still running. The three nations co-hosting the most watched sporting event in human history, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, were legally required, on that exact calendar date, to confirm whether they still wanted a trade agreement with each other. A trade agreement governing $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral commerce. A trade agreement that had replaced NAFTA 6 years earlier. A trade agreement that was, by July 1st, 2026, operating in a political environment that bore no resemblance to the conditions under which it had been signed. They did not confirm it. According to sources present in the ministerial discussion surrounding the July 1 review deadline, the Free Trade Commission, the three-party body required under Chapter 34 of the USMCA to conduct the joint review, convened with the specific understanding that at least one party would not be reaffirming the agreement's continuation under its existing terms. The trade war had done what trade wars reliably do to legal frameworks, built on the assumption of good faith. It had made good faith an insufficient foundation for commitment. Across 16 host cities in 3 countries on that same July 1, 48 nations were competing in the World Cup, the tournament that the United States, Canada, and Mexico had jointly planned, jointly promoted, and jointly branded to the world as a statement of North American partnership at its most powerful. The same 3 governments, the same 3 national flags, the same 3 heads of state who had appeared together in joint promotional imagery for months. In the stadiums, partnership, in the ministerial conference room, something that had stopped being partnership before the review date arrived. Warren Buffett, who tracked the July 1 convergence with the attention he reserves for situations where institutional contradiction reaches the point of public confirmation, said something that has circulated in trade and financial circles since it was first attributed to him. I have seen companies manage their brand and their business in opposite directions at the same time. Buffett said, "It never works. The brand always loses. You cannot tell the world you are partners, in stadiums and photographs, in opening ceremonies, while treating those same partners as economic adversaries in the rooms where the actual terms of the relationship are being decided. The cameras do not last. The terms do." When you hear what actually happened in the weeks surrounding July 1, 2026, in the ministerial sessions, in the back-channel communications between all 3 delegations, and in the specific moment when the USMCA's own review mechanism produced the outcome its architects had designed it to prevent, you will understand why trade economists on all 3 sides of this agreement are calling 2026 the year North American economic integration began its structural reversal. Hit subscribe because the $1.3 trillion question of what comes after the USMCA does not yet have an answer, and every day without one costs something that cannot be recovered. Let me give you the full context. Because the USMCA did not reach July 1st, 2026 without a history that made what happened there comprehensible. It reached that date because the conditions that had produced it, the political will, the economic logic, the shared institutional commitment to an integrated North American economy had been systematically dismantled in the years between its signing and its mandatory review. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, governed trilateral trade from 1994 to 2020. 26 years. During those 26 years, it transformed the economies of all 3 nations in ways that were not uniformly popular and not uniformly beneficial, but that were deep, structural, and as everyone would discover, very difficult to reverse. Supply chains organized across national boundaries. Manufacturing integration that sent components across borders multiple times before they became finished products. Agricultural trade patterns that embedded Canadian wheat, Mexican produce, and American corn into each other's food systems. The $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral commerce that existed by 2026 was built, layer by layer, across those 26 years on the institutional foundation that NAFTA created. The USMCA replaced NAFTA in July 2020. It updated the agreement's provisions for the modern economy, new automotive rules of origin, strengthened labor standards, enhanced intellectual property protections, digital trade chapters at NAFTA drafted in 1994 had no language to address. The structural architecture of North American trade integration remained intact. The $1.3 trillion in trilateral commerce continued to flow on the USMCA's framework as it had on NAFTA's. The USMCA was also designed with a feature its architects described as a mechanism for keeping the agreement current and responsive. Under Chapter 34, the three parties were required to conduct a joint review of the agreement every 6 years, with the first mandatory review falling on July 1, 2026. At the review, each party would formally indicate whether it wished to continue the agreement. If all three reaffirmed their commitment, the agreement extended automatically for another 6 years. If any party declined to reaffirm, the agreement entered what the text calls a sunset period, technically still in force, but subject to annual review, operating without the legal certainty that investors and businesses require to make long-term capital commitments anchored to the trade framework's durability. The architects of the USMCA built the 6-year review as a feature, not a vulnerability. The idea was that a mandatory review would keep the agreement responsive to changing conditions, preventing the institutional fossilization that had made NAFTA difficult to modernize. The review was supposed to be an opportunity for managed evolution. It required, as its foundational assumption, that all three parties would approach it in the same spirit of constructive partnership that had produced the agreement in the first place. What the architects could not build into their 2018 and 2019 assumptions was a scenario in which the review would occur in the middle of a trade war between the three signatory nations, a scenario in which two of the three parties had been subjected to tariffs designed explicitly to reorder the terms of the bilateral economic relationships, a scenario in which the institutional trust that the 6-year review required as its prerequisite had been systematically eroded before the review's mandatory date arrived. Most Americans following the World Cup in June and July of 2026 saw three nations presenting a unified brand to the world. Most Americans following the trade war saw a bilateral conflict with Canada and a separate escalating conflict with Mexico. What almost no one saw, because it required holding both frames in view simultaneously, was that the three nations co-hosting the world's most watched sporting event were, at the exact same moment, legally required to decide whether they still wanted a trade agreement with each other. That the decision was being made under conditions no one in the agreement's design process had anticipated, and that the convergence was not metaphorical, it was a calendar fact. The USMCA's 6-year review date, July 1, 2026, fell during the World Cup tournament. During the event, those same three nations had spent years jointly building as a symbol of their partnership. The review arrived. The partnership did not hold. The Free Trade Commission of the USMCA is the agreement's highest governing body, the three trade ministers, or their designated representatives, empowered to oversee implementation and required under Chapter 34 to conduct the joint review. When the Commission meets formally, it meets with the weight of the $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral commerce as its institutional context. What it decides in a conference room is transmitted into supply chains, currency markets, and manufacturing investment decisions within hours. It met in the weeks surrounding July 1, 2026, under conditions that no Free Trade Commission session in the agreement's 6-year history had encountered. The preparatory process that preceded the July 1 deadline began in April, according to sources familiar with the diplomatic process. The three trade ministers had been in contact through back-channel communications since February, communications that sources describe as increasingly difficult as the trade war's economic consequences accumulated on both sides of both borders. The formal preparatory structure required each party to submit, in advance, a written assessment of the agreement's operation over its 6-year history, what had worked, what required modification, and the conditions under which each party would recommit to the framework for a further 6 years. Canada's submission was detailed, substantive, and according to sources familiar with its contents, framed with a directness that had not characterized Canadian official communication with the United States since the trade war escalated. It documented, specifically and with source data, the economic consequences of the tariff regime on Canadian industries that had structured their operations around the USMCA's explicit commitments. It identified with precision the provisions the tariff policy had rendered effectively inoperative: commitments to market access, to non-discrimination, to the predictability that Canadian businesses had relied upon when making capital investment decisions. And it stated, in language that sources describe as unambiguous without being inflammatory, that Canada would not recommit to the agreement under its existing terms without binding resolution of the ongoing tariff conflict. Mexico's submission, according to sources familiar with its preparation, carried different emphasis and reached the same essential conclusion. The tariff escalation had produced in Mexico a political environment in which recommitting to the USMCA without modifications was not domestically supportable. The agreement had been sold to Mexican industry and labor constituencies on the basis of specific market access commitments. Those commitments had been disrupted by unilateral American tariff action. The political architecture supporting Mexican participation had been built on the assumption that the agreement's terms would be respected. They had not been respected, and Mexico had arrived at the review having prepared its own response accordingly. The formal joint review session convened on the morning of July 1st, 2026, in Washington. The conference room in the office of the United States Trade Representative had been arranged with the standard configuration of a multilateral ministerial meeting: the long table, the translation equipment, the national flags of all three countries positioned behind the ministers' chairs, the stars and stripes, the maple leaf, the eagle and serpent, three flags in the arrangement of nations that had chosen 6 years earlier to build something together. The room configured by institutional habit for partnership. The United States Trade Representative opened with a statement framing the review as an opportunity to update the agreement to reflect changed economic conditions, including conditions the USTR described as relating to trade imbalances and market access deficiencies that the existing agreement had not adequately addressed. The statement identified specific areas in which the United States would require enhanced commitments from its partners as a condition of reaffirmation. Canada's trade minister responded. Sources describe the response as measured, precise, and delivered with the particular quality of restraint that has become the signature of Canadian official communication in this period, a restraint that conveys, through its very control, the weight of what it is containing. Canada had come to the review prepared to discuss modifications, prepared to address legitimate concerns, prepared to engage in good faith renegotiation of the agreement's terms. Canada had not come prepared to accept, as the price of reaffirmation, conditions that amounted to the unilateral revision of the agreement's foundational market access architecture under the continued pressure of ongoing tariff action that the agreement itself did not authorize. The silence in the room after that statement had the specific quality of a silence that occurs when language has been deployed to close off a negotiating space rather than to open one. Mexico's trade minister spoke next. According to sources present, the statement had the quality of something prepared very carefully and delivered with complete stillness. Mexico had joined the USMCA because it represented a framework for stable, rules-based, trilateral economic integration. Mexico remained committed to that framework in principle. Mexico was not in a position to reaffirm an agreement that one party was simultaneously violating through unilateral trade measures inconsistent with the agreement's own provisions. The two things, reaffirmation and ongoing tariff action, could not coexist in the same institutional space. Outside the Winter Building, Washington's early July heat was settling into the afternoon. Somewhere in the city, and in cities across the continent, a World Cup match was being broadcast. The three flags positioned behind the ministers' chairs, the arrangement of partnership, the visual grammar of the agreement's governing body, remained in place throughout the session. The session recessed at 2:47 p.m. without a joint reaffirmation, without a communique, without the statement of continued commitment that the USMCA's architecture required. The agreement did not formally terminate that afternoon. It entered the sunset period, technically still in force, subject to annual review, operating without the legal certainty that gives businesses the confidence to make long-term capital commitments anchored to its framework. The $1.3 trillion had lost its legal floor. And then, within hours, Canada and Mexico issued a joint statement, their own, without American co-signature, noting that both parties had arrived at the review committed to the agreement's foundational principles, that both had been prepared to discuss good faith modifications, and that both remained open to a process of genuine bilateral engagement if and when the conditions for such engagement were established. A joint statement between Canada and Mexico, without the United States, issued following a USMCA review session. Think about that for a moment. The immediate market response to the July 1 recess, without reaffirmation, confirmed how precisely financial institutions had been positioned for exactly this outcome. The Mexican peso fell within the first hour of trading after the session broke. The Canadian dollar moved sharply on bilateral uncertainty pricing. North American automotive stocks, companies whose production models span all three countries and depend on the USMCA's rules of origin commitments to sustain their cross-border manufacturing architecture, declined in a pattern that analysts in their morning notes described as structured exposure unwinding rather than panic. These were not investors reacting to a surprise. They were investors who had been pricing this risk for months, executing positions they had already prepared. The automotive sector's exposure to the sunset period was the most immediately quantifiable consequence. The USMCA's rules of origin provisions, requiring specified percentages of North American content to qualify for tariff-free treatment, are the structural foundation on which the most deeply integrated supply chains in the hemisphere have been built. An F-150 assembled in Michigan sources components from Canadian and Mexican suppliers. A vehicle assembled in Monterrey draws parts from American and Canadian facilities. Those supply chains were built around the USMCA's commitments. The sunset period placed those commitments in a condition of ongoing legal uncertainty. According to sources familiar with the automotive industry's internal response, purchasing managers at every major manufacturer on the continent were in sessions within 24 hours of the July 1 recess to assess the legal status of existing supplier agreements and to analyze what modifications would be required if the USMCA's terms were renegotiated in the annual review. Cycle ahead. The official statements from all three parties moved with the choreography that trade negotiators use when describing failures they cannot afford to call failures. The United States Trade Representative characterized the July 1 session as a productive initial engagement in the review process. Canada and Mexico's joint statement said something more precise, that both parties had arrived prepared for good faith engagement and would remain open to that engagement if conditions permitted. Between those two characterizations, one projecting progress, two projecting conditional availability, lay the accurate description of what had occurred. Leaked accounts from all three delegations, provided by sources who describe themselves as professionals with history stretching back to the original NAFTA negotiating era, converged on a description of the session that the official statements carefully avoided. A senior American trade official, according to a source familiar with the delegation's internal reaction, said something that multiple colleagues later confirmed in substance. He said, "We came in expecting to hold a review. We held a hearing. In a review, all parties are deciding together. In a hearing, one party presents terms and the other parties respond to them. The distinction is not semantic. It determines whether a review produces a partnership or a record." Buffett's economic translation of what July 1, 2026 had produced arrived in the days that followed, and it arrived with the gravity he reserves for institutional failures of this scale. Buffett's response to the USMCA's July 1 moment was built, characteristically, on a single observation about the fundamental incompatibility of what the three nations had been attempting to hold simultaneously. "In 60 years of deal-making," he said, "I have watched companies try to manage their brand and their business in opposite directions at the same time. The brand says partnership. The policy says adversary. The press release says commitment. The tariff says otherwise. This always ends the same way. The brand loses, not because brands don't matter, because terms matter more. The terms of a relationship are what the relationship actually is. Everything else is advertising, and you cannot advertise your way out of terms that have already been set. He applied this directly to the World Cup and the USMCA review, with the bluntness that characterizes his most important observations. 3 nations co-hosting the World Cup is a statement about partnership. Tariffs of 50% on Canadian goods and escalating levies on Mexican goods, imposed while simultaneously requiring those same partners to reaffirm a trade agreement that those tariffs had already materially violated, that is a statement about something else entirely. You cannot negotiate a trade agreement with a party while imposing punitive tariffs on that party and expect the negotiation to proceed on the basis of mutual trust, he said. This is not a diplomatic observation. It is a mathematical one. The tariffs are a data point. The data point the other parties were reading from. And the data point said, "We do not intend to treat you as an equal partner." The review session was not capable of producing a different conclusion than the data. The historical parallel he drew was to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, a multilateral framework governing international monetary relations since 1944, ended unilaterally by the United States when the domestic economic pressures of maintaining the framework exceeded what one party was willing to absorb. Bretton Woods worked, Buffett said, until the costs of maintaining it exceeded what the United States was prepared to pay. The moment that calculation changed, the framework ended. Not gradually, not through negotiated revision, all at once. Because multilateral frameworks are only as strong as the commitment of their least committed member. They do not degrade slowly. They collapse when the weakest commitment is tested, and testing it reveals that it was already gone. The USMCA, he said, was a multilateral framework whose foundational commitment, the commitment to treat the other parties as equal partners in a rules-based trading relationship, had been withdrawn through unilateral tariff action before the mandatory review arrived. The 6-year review was not the end of the USMCA, Buffett said. The 6-year review was the date on which the end became official. The USMCA ended when the tariffs began. July 1 was the certificate. He then connected the $1, $3 trillion in annual trilateral trade to the specific category of economic cost that is most difficult to recover, the cost of investment decisions made under the assumption that a framework would hold, now exposed to a framework in a legal sunset. Companies built plants, he said. They signed supplier agreements. They structured North American operations around the assumption that the USMCA's commitments were durable and that the 6-year review was a governance mechanism, not a threat. The cost of the agreement's uncertainty is not a tariff percentage. It is every capital investment decision anchored to the agreement's durability that now has no legal floor beneath it. That cost is in the hundreds of billions. It does not appear on any tariff schedule. It does not reverse when someone reaffirms the document next July. The investment decisions have already been made. The supply chains have already begun restructuring. The certainty that drove those decisions cannot be reinstalled by a signature on a form. The verdict, a trade framework, is not a document. It is a commitment. You can reprint the document. You cannot restore the commitment by reprinting it. July 1 just made official what the tariffs had already accomplished. And official damage, unlike ambiguous damage, compounds with interest. The consequences of the USMCA's entry into the sunset period cascaded across the North American economy with the force of a risk that markets had been pricing for months and that had now materialized in confirmed, documented form. The automotive sector bore the most immediately quantifiable burden. North American auto production is organized around the USMCA's rules of origin requirements with no equivalent in any other trade relationship on Earth. A qualifying vehicle must contain a specified percentage of North American content, sourced from suppliers operating within the agreement's framework, produced by workers meeting specified wage standards. Those requirements created a supply chain ecosystem crossing all 3 countries in integrated, interdependent patterns built over decades. That ecosystem depends, for its commercial viability, on the certainty that the tariff-free treatment it was designed to qualify for will continue to be available. The sunset period created a legal environment in which that treatment was subject to annual review, not guaranteed, not permanent. Reviewable. For a purchasing manager justifying a 10-year supplier contract, reviewable means unviable. Within 60 days of the July 1 session, 3 major automotive manufacturers had announced supply chain reviews, described in corporate communications as prudent reassessments of North American sourcing in light of evolving trade frameworks. In the language that corporate communications use when describing something irreversible, without using the word irreversible, that means we are beginning the process of restructuring our supply chains away from their current cross-border configuration. That process, once begun, does not reverse when a political environment changes. It is capital-intensive, multi-year, and permanent in its infrastructure consequences. The agricultural consequences were equally structural and less publicly visible. The USMCA's agricultural provisions govern an enormous cross-border flow, American corn going to Mexico, Mexican produce feeding American consumers, Canadian wheat and dairy moving across both borders under the agreement's market access commitments. For the businesses built on those flows, the sunset period was not a pricing problem. It was a planning horizon problem. You cannot plant a crop, structure a processing facility, or sign a distribution agreement on the basis of trade terms that are subject to annual review in a political environment where the review has already failed to produce reaffirmation once. On the defense and security dimension, the USMCA's entry into the sunset period reinforced what military planners had been warning about privately for months, that a trade war affecting both Canada and Mexico simultaneously was degrading the North American defense industrial base in ways that could not be measured in tariff percentages. Canadian components in American defense platforms, Mexican manufactured parts in American military supply chains. The $1.3 trillion annual economic relationship that the USMCA governed was not separate from the defense relationship. It was embedded in it. And legal uncertainty at the trade framework level introduced operational uncertainty at the defense supply chain level, an outcome that defense acquisition officials did not design and cannot easily remedy. The international signal reached every country that maintains a trade agreement with the United States, and every country considering one. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the European Union. The uniform message received from the July 1 session was specific and durable. The United States had demonstrated that it would use its own trade agreements review mechanism as leverage to impose new terms on partners who had structured their economies around the existing agreement's commitments. That is not a negotiating tactic that can be employed once without changing the negotiating environment permanently. Every future American trade agreement will be negotiated by partners who have watched what happened to the USMCA's reaffirmation, and they will negotiate accordingly with shorter terms, stronger exit clauses, and the specific wariness of parties who have learned that American trade commitments carry a political shelf life. China's response required no translation and no delay. Beijing had been offering expanded trade engagement to both Canada and Mexico throughout the trade war period. The July 1 session made those offers structurally more attractive than at any prior moment since the USMCA's signing. The agreement had been, among other things, a framework for managing North American economic integration in a way that reduced the leverage of external actors, including China, over the continent's commercial architecture. Its entry into the sunset period was a documented weakening of that management function, and China moved with the methodical satisfaction of a strategic competitor whose primary adversary has reduced, through its own institutional decisions, the defensive coherence of its most important regional alliance. The World Cup final was played at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey on July 19, 2026. The 3 host nations' flags were displayed together in the stadium, as they had been displayed together at every tournament venue since June 11. The opening ceremony for the final included a segment celebrating the 3 co-host nations, their shared geography, their shared history, their partnership in presenting the tournament to the world. 80,000 people in the stadium. Billions watching the broadcast. The USMCA's reaffirmation deadline had passed 18 days earlier. Unmet. There is a truth about institutional frameworks that every person who has spent serious time building or watching them fail has internalized, and that every person who has worked only at the level of the press release has not. A framework is not what the document says. A framework is what the parties do. The document records what the parties committed to doing. The party's behavior is the actual framework, and when the behavior diverges irrecoverably from the commitment, when tariffs are imposed on partners bound by market access agreements, when unilateral demands replace bilateral negotiation, when the 6-year review designed for managed evolution becomes the setting for a documented collapse, the framework ends, regardless of whether the document is still technically in force, regardless of whether anyone has signed a termination notice. The commitment is the framework. When the commitment is gone, the framework is gone. The USMCA entered its sunset period on July 1, 2026. The $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral commerce continued to cross the same 3 borders. The World Cup continued in the same 3 host nations for another 18 days. The document remained technically in effect. The commitment that is the actual framework had not survived the trade war that preceded the review. It had been withdrawing since the tariffs began. July 1 was the date on which its withdrawal became official, documented, and permanent in its institutional consequences. Buffett said it with the plainness that defines his particular authority. A trade framework is not a document. It is a commitment. You can reprint the document. You cannot restore the commitment by reprinting it. The commitment was withdrawn before July 1. July 1 just made it official. 3 flags, 16 stadiums, $1.3 trillion in annual commerce, and the trade agreement governing that commerce, the agreement that the same 3 nations co-hosting the World Cup had signed 6 years earlier as the foundation of North American economic integration, in a sunset period that no one standing in those stadiums was told had begun. The USMCA's annual review is scheduled for 2027. The supply chains that have already begun restructuring away from their cross-border configurations will not pause their restructuring while diplomats prepare for another review session. The investment decisions already made on the basis of post-July 1 uncertainty are already being executed in facilities being built and contracts being signed in configurations that do not assume the USMCA's framework holds. The capital that has already begun migrating toward more stable trade environments does not wait for political calendars. The 26 years of North American economic integration that NAFTA and the USMCA built, layer by layer and deal by deal, is being unmade at a pace that will surprise everyone who assumes that institutional decisions of this magnitude can be reversed as quickly as they were made. They cannot. And the cost of learning that is being paid every day, the review clock advances toward 2027 without a commitment that holds.